"She's crying, please someone, she's crying." Kevin Miller whispered these words into the void of the early morning, his hands trembling uncontrollably as he held something that would change his life forever. Something no 16-year-old should find on his way to work. Something that society had discarded as worthless trash, thrown among rubble and dirt as if it were nothing. A baby, a newborn girl, still with her umbilical cord attached, abandoned in a black trash bag. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let me tell you how we got here. Before we dive into the story, leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Kevin was 16, but his hands looked 40. Calloused from years of hard labor, cut by sharp aluminum cans, stained with oil and grime that no amount of soap could completely remove. His fingernails were permanently blackened, his cuticles cracked and occasionally bleeding when the cold was particularly brutal. They were hands that told stories Kevin would rather forget, stories of survival on the fringes, of working since he was 12 when his mother died and he had to become an adult overnight, of a childhood stolen by circumstances he didn't choose but had to face every day. At 4:15 on that November Monday morning, those hands were pushing a rusty shopping cart through the completely empty streets of the Bronx, New York City, statistically one of the most socially challenging areas, not just in the city, but in the entire country. The wheels of the cart squeaked in an irregular rhythm that Kevin had learned to find strangely comforting, the sound of his own struggle, of his honest work in a world that often seemed to reward him only with more hardship. The November cold in New York cut like sharp blades through his thin jacket, a second-hand piece he had bought at a Goodwill for $5 3 winters ago. The fabric was torn at the left elbow, the zipper hadn't closed properly for 2 years, but it was all he had. Kevin had learned long ago through hard and repeated experience that complaining about the cold, the hunger or the fatigue changed absolutely nothing in reality. It just wasted precious energy he needed to save to survive another day, another week, another month in this life that felt like a race with no finish line. He had a specific route, meticulously planned and refined over 4 years of trial and error, of learning which places yielded the most material and which were just a waste of time. It started with the commercial buildings on the Grand Concourse, where law firms, accounting offices, and small businesses discarded paper and cardboard in quantities that seemed absurd to someone who had nothing. The night security guards knew him by sight. Some even set aside recyclables in organized piles to make his job easier. Kevin always thanked them politely, reminding himself that dignity cost nothing and often yielded small, valuable kindnesses in return. After the route through the offices, he passed by the restaurants and diners in the area that threw away aluminum cans, the real gold of the recycling world, worth about $1 a pound when the market was good. The restaurant managers tolerated him, as long as he didn't make a mess, didn't leave trash scattered about, and took everything he found without complaint. Kevin was extremely careful, almost obsessively organized in his work. He never, ever left evidence of his passage, never gave reason for complaint. His route ended at the lower middle-class apartment buildings on Acacia Avenue, where people threw away plastic PET bottles and Tetra Pak containers without a second thought about their destination. To them, it was simply inconvenient trash that needed to disappear. For Kevin, it was the concrete difference between eating a decent meal or sleeping with his stomach growling with hunger. Between having money for the subway pass for school or walking 5 miles under the sun or in the rain. Between buying the increasingly expensive medications for his grandmother with progressive dementia or watching her suffer from pains she could no longer describe or remember where they came from. If you've ever experienced real need, the kind of need that makes you count every penny and reuse every last crumb, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. Leave a comment if this reality touches you in any way, if you or someone close to you has experienced something similar. His cart was already about half full, maybe 40 pounds of assorted material, which would fetch about $20 at Mr. Anderson's scrapyard if he was generous with the weight, when Kevin turned onto Daisy Street at exactly 4:37 a.m. He knew the precise time because over the years he had developed a frighteningly accurate internal clock, born out of the necessity of managing an impossible routine that left no room for error. Daisy Street was particularly dark and menacing that morning because 3 streetlights had been out for months, maybe even a year. Kevin had reported the problem to the city 5 different times. Nothing happened. No one cared enough about a forgotten street in a poor neighborhood to fix something as basic as public lighting. But Kevin knew every treacherous pothole in the broken and uneven asphalt, every potentially dangerous corner where dealers did their nightly business without worrying about witnesses, every abandoned house that could harbor any kind of invisible danger in the darkness. He knew exactly how to move like a ghost, invisible, silent, non-threatening, not to make unnecessary noise, not to attract attention in any way, not to exist more than absolutely necessary to complete his work and move on before the sun rose. In his community, in his daily reality, curiosity was far too expensive. People who saw things they shouldn't see, who asked questions they shouldn't ask, who meddled in affairs that weren't theirs, those people disappeared. Their bodies sometimes turned up days or weeks later in vacant lots, in rivers, in forgotten places. Other times, they just disappeared completely, as if they had never existed, as if their lives had meant nothing to anyone. It was at that exact moment, when Kevin was almost finished with his collection on that specific street, that he heard the sound. A sound so faint, so muffled that he almost lost it completely in the distant noise of a car passing 2 streets away, its tires singing on the wet asphalt from the light drizzle that had fallen during the night. A muffled, high-pitched, desperate, urgent cry, the kind of sound that activates deep, primitive instincts in the human brain that we have evolved over thousands of years, the unmistakable sound of something very small, very vulnerable, very close to death. Kevin froze completely mid-step, in the middle of reaching for a pet bottle lying near the curb. All his survival instincts, carefully cultivated over difficult years, screamed loud and clear inside his head to keep walking, not to get involved in any way, to protect himself above all else. But the crying continued, gradually getting fainter, more desperate, as if whoever was making that sound was giving up, losing the last of their hope. And there was something about that specific sound that made Kevin's stomach clench painfully, with a visceral recognition he couldn't rationally explain, that went beyond logic and touched something deeper. It was the sound of pure and absolute desperation, of complete abandonment, of a life desperately depending on someone, anyone, to do something before it was too late. Kevin looked around nervously and quickly, searching for any sign of life, anyone who might be hearing the same thing. The street was completely deserted, wrapped in an almost palpable darkness that seemed to swallow even the sounds. A few sparse windows had faint lights on, people probably waking up reluctantly to make coffee, put on work uniforms, start another exhausting day of toil that would barely pay the bills at the end of the month. But all the curtains were firmly, deliberately closed. No one was looking out. No one wanted to witness absolutely anything that could be used against them later, that could put them in any kind of danger or complication, that could turn their already sufficiently complicated lives into something even worse. Kevin left his cart chained to a post. 4 years of hard work accumulated in that cart, he couldn't risk losing it, and followed the ever fainter sound to a vacant and neglected lot between 2 houses that had been completely abandoned for years. The lot was absolutely full of construction debris, broken roof tiles, large chunks of concrete, wooden beams rotted by time and moisture. Tall weeds grew wild among the rubble, and trash was piled up in stinking and disgusting mounds that would probably never, ever be collected by the city. The smell that hit Kevin when he entered the lot was absolutely nauseating. physical in its intensity, overflowing and stagnant sewage, organic decomposition in various stages, human and animal urine accumulated over months or years, feces and something that could very well be an animal carcass in an advanced stage of putrefaction. Kevin covered his nose and mouth firmly with the collar of his thin jacket, breathing through the fabric that minimally filtered the air, while his eyes painfully adjusted to the even deeper and more oppressive darkness among the accumulated rubble. He blinked rapidly several times, forcing his pupils to dilate to their maximum, using the faint yellowish lights from the distant street to navigate the treacherous terrain full of invisible dangers. The crying was coming from a 50-gallon black industrial trash bag, partially open, thrown completely carelessly over an unstable pile of broken moss-covered roof tiles, as if it were absolutely insignificant or worthless waste. Kevin approached very slowly, his heart hammering violently against his ribs with a physical and painful force that made his entire chest ache for real. His hands trembled uncontrollably. His breath became shallow, almost impossible. Cold sweat ran down his back, despite the freezing temperature of the dawn. He had found many absolutely horrible things in his 4 years of collecting trash in the early mornings of New York's most forgotten streets. Dead animals in advanced states of decomposition that made him vomit violently until there was nothing left in his stomach. Used syringes that he had to collect with extreme care, using thick industrial gloves to prevent fatal accidents with HIV, hepatitis B, hepatitis C. Weapons discarded after crimes. Rusty pistols, revolvers with filed-off serial numbers, even a semi-destroyed submachine gun once that he anonymously reported to the police, even though he knew they would probably never investigate. Even parts of dismembered human bodies once, a traumatic memory that still regularly woke him up sweaty and screaming from violent nightmares from which it took him minutes to fully recover. But absolutely nothing in all his difficult experience had minimally prepared him for what he was about to see inside that ordinary trash bag. Inside the black industrial trash bag, wrapped in old, completely bloody and dirty towels that looked like they hadn't been properly washed in many months, was a human baby. A real human baby. Alive, crying faintly. Kevin literally felt his legs give way violently under the weight of the shock. He had to hold on tightly to a rotten and half-broken wooden beam to keep from falling face first onto the dirty ground. His vision dangerously darkened at the edges, narrowing into a tunnel. For a genuinely terrifying moment, he thought for sure he was going to faint right there, fall unconscious in the middle of the trash and filth. The baby was absolutely tiny, with the reddish, wrinkled and delicate skin characteristic of a newborn who couldn't be more than a few days old at most. The umbilical cord was still partially attached to the tiny body, cut in a crude and completely irregular manner, probably with a pair of kitchen scissors without any sterilization or perhaps even a common knife. The end of the cord was visibly dark and infected, with yellowish pus clearly visible even in the dim available light. The baby was trembling violently, uncontrollably, its tiny fists clenched and beating the air in completely uncoordinated and desperate movements. Its tiny legs contracted in spasms that in no way seemed natural or normal. Its mouth was open in a cry that had become completely hoarse and broken. The shattered voice of someone who had screamed and cried for so long, for so many hours on end, that the delicate vocal cords were physically damaged. Kevin literally couldn't process what he was seeing with his own eyes. His brain completely refused to accept this impossible and horrible reality. People abandoned unwanted babies in relatively safe places where someone would find them quickly. Public hospitals, church doors, fire stations, police stations, places where there were people, where there were cameras, where the baby would be immediately helped. No one, absolutely no one, threw a newborn baby in the trash in a completely forgotten vacant lot in one of New York's most dangerous and neglected neighborhoods in the middle of the night when no one was around. This was something out of a low-budget horror movie, out of a sensationalist newspaper headline that you read with horror and disbelief, thinking, what kind of absolute monster would do something so horrible to an innocent child? But here it was, real, happening right in front of him, impossible to deny or ignore. For an endless moment that seemed to stretch for hours, Kevin just stood there completely frozen, his mind completely locked between the visceral shock that paralyzed his entire body and the absolute paralyzing terror about what on earth to do now. Logic said he should call someone immediately. He should scream for help until someone appeared. He should call the police, an ambulance, Child Protective Services, any official institution that theoretically existed specifically to protect vulnerable and abandoned children like this one. But the brutal reality of his specific situation hit him like an extremely hard and direct punch to the stomach that literally took his breath away. He had no cell phone, never had, could never afford the monthly costs, even if he desperately wanted to. The only working public payphone within a radius of at least 8 or 10 blocks had been vandalized and completely broken for weeks, maybe even months. And if he screamed for help now, at this exact moment, on this specific street, in this forgotten neighborhood at this time of the morning, absolutely no one would come. No one would open their locked doors. No one would get involved in any way. The people who lived on Daisy Street and the surrounding streets had learned long ago, through extremely painful and sometimes genuinely fatal experiences, to deliberately not get involved in absolutely anything, to actively not see what was happening around them, to carefully not hear sounds that could mean trouble. Selective deafness and voluntary blindness were absolutely essential and non-negotiable survival mechanisms. You didn't see when local drug dealers did their open transactions. You didn't hear when violent fights between rival gangs ended with gunshots and screams. You didn't witness when something clearly bad was happening to someone, because witnessing publicly meant becoming a target, meant running a real risk of violent retaliation. If you're wondering how a society can get to this point of total disconnection, of such extreme individualism that even a crying baby is ignored, keep reading. The answer will truly shock you and perhaps make you rethink many things about how we live. Kevin looked around desperately one more time, frantically searching for any sign of human life, any awakened conscious person, any remote possibility of external help. The street remained completely empty, absolutely ghostly in the oppressive pre-dawn darkness. A few sparse windows had faint yellowish lights on, people probably preparing cheap instant coffee, putting on worn-out industrial uniforms, robotically starting another absolutely identical day of hard and poorly paid work. But literally all the curtains were firmly, deliberately closed. No one even thought of looking out. No one wanted to see, know, or witness absolutely anything that could in any way complicate lives that were already sufficiently, impossibly complicated on their own. The baby suddenly cried louder, a sound that cut through the heavy silence of the dawn, like extremely sharp glass tearing delicate skin. It was a sound that literally awakened every deep protective instinct that Kevin had no idea he possessed within himself. At that specific moment, staring at this absolutely tiny and completely vulnerable human being who was totally dependent on someone doing something to survive, Kevin made an instantaneous and irreversible decision that would change his entire life completely and forever. He took off his thin and worn-out jacket, the only real protection he had against the biting and uncomfortable cold of a New York November dawn, and wrapped the baby with extreme care, genuinely terrified of accidentally hurting something so frighteningly fragile that it seemed like it could completely break with the slightest touch. The small body was ice-cold to the touch, trembling violently and uncontrollably. The skin had a worrying bluish tinge that Kevin instinctively, viscerally knew meant dangerous and potentially fatal hypothermia. But the baby was alive. So miraculously, impossibly, frighteningly alive. Kevin held the small human bundle firmly against his own thin chest, feeling the tiny and rapid heartbeats through the layers of fabric, and just ran. Ran like he had never run in his life. He completely left behind his shopping cart 40 pounds of carefully collected recyclable material that represented literally hours of hard work and a crucial $20 he desperately needed to survive the week. Completely forgot about his meticulously planned route and just ran blindly through the narrow and winding alleys that he knew absolutely by heart until he finally got home. Home. The word sounded almost ironic, almost cruel in its inadequacy to describe the place where Kevin Miller had lived for exactly 3 years. Hope House was a 7-story building that in the distant 70s had been a decadent hotel called the Grand. When the neighborhood still held some fragile aspirations of being lower middle class, the hotel offered extremely modest but relatively clean rooms for low-budget business travelers and poor families. After the hotel went completely bankrupt in 1989, an inevitable victim of the devastating economic crisis that literally ravaged the entire country, the building stood completely abandoned for exactly 2 decades, slowly deteriorating inexorably. Windows were broken by vandals and never replaced. Plumbing was stolen and sold as scrap metal. Electrical wiring was torn from the walls and traded. The building became an occasional refuge for heavy drug users, for desperate homeless people looking for any minimal shelter from the rain and cold, for enormous rats and cockroaches that multiplied without control. In 2012, an organized movement of homeless people, absolutely desperate due to the chronic and systemic lack of affordable public housing and inspired by similar successful social movements in other parts of New York, occupied the completely abandoned space. They stormed the forgotten building in a coordinated pre-dawn operation, cleared tons of debris accumulated over decades, made absolutely basic structural repairs with minimal financial resources and a lot of creativity, and gradually transformed what had been a depressing monument to uncontrolled urban decay into an unlikely home for exactly 230 families who literally had absolutely nowhere else to go. The occupation was technically, legally illegal. The original owner had died many years ago, leaving the building abandoned in an extremely complex legal limbo of endless inheritance disputes among distant relatives that had been dragging on for many years in the overcrowded courts. The city occasionally formally threatened forced eviction, especially when the media paid temporary attention, but never really followed through concretely with the threats because it simply had absolutely no viable alternative to offer 230 entire displaced families. So Hope House existed perpetually in an uncomfortable grey area, tolerated out of pure practical necessity, ignored for obvious political convenience, but never ever legally legitimized or genuinely supported with public resources. Kevin lived specifically on the 4th floor of the building in a former hotel room number 407 that now physically housed 12 people living in conditions that would immediately fill the eyes of any serious social worker with tears of shock and outrage. He shared about 250 square feet with his 72-year-old maternal grandmother, who suffered from advanced dementia and progressive Alzheimer's, a complete family of 6, originally from Syria, who had fled the war in desperation, and 3 adult men who worked heavily in construction and came home every night completely exhausted and covered in cement dust. The collective apartment had a single shared bathroom, a tiny bathroom that 12 different people used daily for all their needs, with no functioning hot water, with plumbing that clogged regularly at least once a week, often leaving the space completely unusable for several days in a row until someone could gather the necessary materials and the basic technical knowledge to fix it. Privacy was a completely forgotten, abstract luxury, something that belonged to another world. Basic human dignity was something you literally fought to maintain every day against circumstances that actively conspired to rob it from you piece by piece. Kevin entered quietly through the dark and poorly lit hallway of the fourth floor, his heart still hammering violently, the baby now quiet against his chest, but constantly trembling in small spasms. It was exactly 5:10 a.m. The absolute majority of people were still fast asleep, desperately enjoying the last precious minutes of rest before facing another absolutely brutal day of work and struggle. He quickly passed the shared community kitchen on the floor, where 6 different families shared only 2 old and broken stoves and a single old refrigerator that worked only intermittently when it felt like it, and finally reached his tiny space in the collective room. His personal room was an area of about 30 square feet, smaller than many middle-class bathrooms, precariously separated from the rest of the space by extremely thin curtains of cheap fabric that blocked no sound at all, and barely blocked sight if someone really wanted to peek. He had a thin foam mattress of maybe 2 inches on the floor, a mattress he had found discarded on the street 2 years ago and had meticulously, obsessively washed multiple times, covered with worn but scrupulously clean sheets that he religiously washed every week without fail. A cardboard box, reinforced with duct tape, contained his scarce clothes, carefully folded because he had so few that he couldn't afford to waste or wrinkle any of them. His important school books were stacked neatly in another strategic corner, obsessively protected in multiple layers of plastic bags against constant humidity and ubiquitous insects. And there was a single carefully framed photo of his mother, the only thing of genuine sentimental value he owned in the entire world. Maria Miller had died when Kevin was exactly 12 years old, a victim of aggressive breast cancer that was tragically diagnosed too late because she had no private health insurance, and the public health clinics had absurd waiting lists of 6 full months just to get a basic mammogram. She had fought bravely, desperately for 8 horrible months, gradually wasting away until she practically disappeared, and her last faint words to Kevin, whispered with increasing difficulty as she held his small hand, were simply, "Take care of Grandma, son, promise me." Kevin had solemnly promised at that moment, and he had been faithfully keeping that promise for 4 long and difficult years, even when it meant literally sacrificing practically everything of his own adolescence that should have been normal. He laid the baby down extremely carefully on the thin mattress and finally stopped for a moment to really, truly process what he had just done. His hands were still trembling completely out of control. His heart was beating so fast, so hard, that he genuinely felt physical dizziness, nausea rising in waves in his throat. The baby was still crying faintly, but now the sound was weaker, more desperate, more defeated. The cry of someone who was literally giving up on life. Kevin looked around desperately in his tiny space in growing genuine panic. He urgently needed warm water, disposable diapers, specific formula for newborn babies, appropriate medication for the visible infection. But he had absolutely none of it, literally nothing. He was 16 years old, lived in a technically illegal squat, worked hard collecting recyclable trash at dawn to earn a miserable $100 a week, and studied at an extremely precarious public night school where half the teachers were regularly absent without notice. He could barely manage to take minimal care of himself and his grandmother with dementia. How on earth? How in the world was he going to manage to properly care for a newborn baby who clearly, obviously, needed urgent and intensive professional medical attention? The baby suddenly started to tremble even more violently than before. Small, frightening convulsions that made its absolutely tiny body contort in ways that were definitely, clearly not natural or normal in any way. White foam started to appear at the tiny corners of the baby's mouth, small bubbles that formed and burst repeatedly. Its little eyes rolled back dangerously, showing a lot of white. Its little legs stretched out rigidly, completely tense. Kevin had seen this exact thing before, had witnessed it multiple times, heavy crack users having violent convulsions on the streets, in alleys, in public squares. People in severe withdrawal from extremely heavy drugs, their bodies going into biochemical shock because the chemical substance they were completely dependent on was no longer present in their system. He recognized the classic signs perfectly because he had watched his own beloved mother go through horrible morphine withdrawal in the overcrowded public hospital, when the overworked doctors drastically reduced her dose because they thought she was developing a worrying chemical dependency and they needed to control the use. This tiny baby had been born to a mother who was a heavy drug addict. The baby was going through severe neonatal abstinence syndrome, and Kevin knew, with an instinctive and terrifying certainty, that without proper and extremely urgent medical treatment, babies could easily die from these violent convulsions. The delicate brain could suffer permanent and irreversible damage. The fragile organs could go into multiple failure. Kevin felt hot tears burn intensely in his tired eyes, threatening to overflow and roll down his face. He needed help, desperately, urgently. But where? How? If he took the baby directly to the nearest public hospital, a run of at least 20 minutes, if he somehow miraculously managed to stop a taxi, which was extremely unlikely without money to show up front, they would ask 1,000 complicated questions that he simply couldn't answer satisfactorily. Whose baby is this exactly? Who are the biological parents? Where did you get this child? Why didn't you immediately report it to the proper authorities? To formally report it would inevitably involve the police, social services, and a whole complex institutional system that Kevin knew very, very well from painful personal experience. A system that looked at poor teenagers living in illegal squats and automatically saw potential dangerous criminals, not potential heroic saviors. A system that would absolutely immediately separate him from the baby, that would aggressively question him about his true intentions, that would very possibly even accuse him of something terrible like kidnapping or child trafficking. A system that would place the vulnerable baby in an overcrowded and underfunded state institution where children literally disappeared regularly into cold statistics, were systematically neglected due to a chronic lack of human and material resources, were often physically and sexually abused by overworked and underpaid staff, or simply died silently because no one noticed they were sick until it was too late to do anything. Kevin knew these horrible things, not from rumor or assumption, but because he had researched extensively, because in school he had done a detailed research project on the American system of institutional care for minors. The statistics he discovered were absolutely terrifying and desolate. Children who entered the system were 5 times more likely to get involved with heavy drugs in their teens, 10 times more likely to end up in prison, 3 times more likely to commit suicide before the age of 25. But leaving the baby without any professional medical help meant literally watching her die slowly, here, now, in his inexperienced and unprepared arms. Kevin stood up abruptly with sudden and desperate determination. He took a 16-ounce bottle of mineral water that he had carefully filled at a free public fountain in the square the day before, carefully heated a little in the only small pot he owned using an ingenious improvised stove, an old aluminum can with multiple carefully drilled holes filled with denatured alcohol that he bought for $3 at the corner store. He gently wet a relatively clean cloth, one of the very few he had, which he religiously washed by hand and dried in the sun whenever possible, in the warm water, and began to clean the baby with extreme care and gentleness. The umbilical cord was clearly, obviously, seriously infected. Kevin could see not only the abundant yellowish pus, but also a worrying redness spreading visibly around the area, a sign he instinctively knew meant a bacterial infection was spreading dangerously through the tiny body. He used hydrogen peroxide that he kept in a small bottle, specifically to clean his own frequent cuts and wounds from the sharp aluminum cans, and carefully, meticulously bandaged the navel with clean gauze that he had managed to get, technically stolen but out of real medical necessity, from a public health clinic months ago when his grandmother had a nasty wound that needed daily dressings for weeks. The baby was definitely a girl. Kevin noticed while cleaning her with extreme care and obsessive attention, genuinely terrified of accidentally hurting something so incredibly fragile that it seemed like it could completely break with the slightest touch or wrong move. She weighed maybe 5.5 pounds at most, drastically below the expected normal weight for a healthy newborn, which should be between 6.5 and 7.5 pounds, according to what he had read somewhere. Her little arms and legs were frighteningly thin like dry twigs, with practically no visible body fat. Her ribs were clearly, sharply visible through the translucent skin that seemed almost transparent under the dim light. She was dying slowly. Kevin knew this with absolute instinctive, visceral certainty. No specialized doctors or complicated tests were needed to confirm the completely obvious. This helpless baby was literally on the edge, on the brink of death, and urgently needed immediate professional medical intervention. He needed to make a decision, now, immediately, without further hesitation. "Aunt Martha," Kevin whispered urgently but quietly, carefully stepping out of his tiny space and knocking gently but insistently on the thin curtain of his direct neighbor next door. "Aunt Martha, please. I know I woke you up, but I need help. I really, really need it." Martha Hayes was 43 years old, but she easily looked 60 or even 65, severely and prematurely aged by a lifetime of hard and inhumane labor, chronic and hopeless poverty, and accumulated personal tragedies that would have completely broken far less resilient and strong people. She had had 7 children throughout her life. Only 4 were still alive. 3 she had tragically, painfully lost to the uncontrolled urban violence that consumed poor young people with absolutely terrifying statistical regularity. A 17-year-old son killed in a random shootout between police and drug dealers simply because he was walking in the wrong place at the wrong time. A 15-year-old daughter killed by a stray bullet while coming home from school. Another 20-year-old son brutally murdered in a rival gang fight for reasons she never fully understood. Now she was raising 4 orphaned grandchildren completely on her own after her eldest daughter, Caroline, died of a fatal heroin overdose 2 years ago, leaving 4 small children completely orphaned and helpless. Martha worked as a cleaner in 3 different and simultaneous jobs: a city hospital from 5 to 9 in the morning, a commercial office from 10 to noon, and a luxury apartment building from 6 to 10 at night. She slept a maximum of 4 hours a night, never ever in a continuous and restorative period. And yet she somehow, in a completely inexplicable and seemingly miraculous way, found time to generously help other residents of the squat who were going through temporary difficulties or acute crises. She quickly opened the curtain with sleepy eyes that widened in absolute visual shock when they saw the small bundle in Kevin's arms, a baby who was clearly, obviously newborn, crying faintly in a pathetic way. "My God in heaven," she breathed heavily, automatically and out of habit, making the Catholic sign of the cross that she had literally made thousands of times throughout her life. "Kevin, what have you done? Where on earth did this little baby come from?" "I found her," Kevin said quickly, desperately, the words tumbling out jumbled and confused. "In the trash, Aunt Martha. She was just thrown in the trash as if she were nothing, as if she were worth absolutely nothing. In a common black trash bag in that horrible vacant lot on Daisy Street. She would have died for sure if she stayed there. I couldn't just leave her there to die. I just couldn't do it." Martha quickly entered Kevin's narrow space, carefully closing the thin curtain behind her so as not to wake the other residents of the collective room who were still fast asleep. She took the baby with experienced and capable hands, hands that had held, cared for, and fed hundreds of babies over decades of being a multiple-time mother, a dedicated grandmother, and even an informal midwife in the community when desperate women couldn't afford a hospital or simply didn't trust the public medical system. Her trained and experienced eyes scanned the tiny body systematically, professionally, noticing every significant detail that Kevin had missed or didn't know how to properly interpret. The clearly infected and crudely and dangerously cut umbilical cord. The continuous and worrying tremors that indicated severe withdrawal from heavy drugs. The extreme and unhealthy pallor. The shallow, irregular and labored breathing. The evident severe dehydration. The multiple converging signs that this baby had been born in absolutely terrible conditions and was now in critical, immediate danger of her life. "This baby needs a hospital urgently," Martha said firmly, but in a low voice, her voice authoritative but controlled. "Now, immediately, no negotiation possible. She has a generalized bacterial infection, severe dehydration, and is clearly going through withdrawal from crack or heroin, or very possibly both simultaneously. If she doesn't receive professional medical treatment in the next few hours, not days or weeks, but hours, she will die for sure, Kevin. Do you completely understand? This little child is going to die." "I know perfectly well," Kevin said, and his voice failed completely, breaking into a sob that he desperately tried to suppress. "I know that, Aunt Martha. But if I take her to the hospital now, they'll call the police immediately. They'll ask 1,000 complicated questions. They'll inevitably find out that I live here, that the squat is technically illegal, that my grandmother doesn't even know who I am half the time because her dementia is getting progressively worse. They'll probably take me away from here too. They'll separate my grandmother from me. And the baby. Aunt Martha, you know better than absolutely anyone what really happens to vulnerable babies who go into the system." Martha was silent, a heavy and significant silence, because she knew. She knew intimately, painfully, through traumatic personal experience. She had lost temporary legal custody of her own children for 2 whole and devastating years when she was completely unjustly arrested for drug possession, drugs that her extremely violent ex-boyfriend had secretly hidden in their house without her knowing absolutely anything, and that the police found during an aggressive raid. Without enough money for a truly competent lawyer, she was quickly convicted based on purely weak, circumstantial evidence. Her children were separated and distributed to multiple different foster homes where they suffered physical, psychological, and even sexual abuse that marked them deeply, irreversibly forever. Her eldest son, Michael, who was only 8 years old at the time, was repeatedly sexually abused by one of the supposedly trustworthy temporary caregivers. Her daughter, Anne, who was a fragile 6 years old, was neglected so severely that she developed serious malnutrition even though she was officially under the direct supervision of the state. When Martha finally managed to prove her complete innocence after an exhaustive legal battle and heroically regained custody, her children were completely different children, deeply traumatized, constantly scared, broken in ways that subsequent years of intense love and dedicated care could never completely heal. "What do you want to do then?" Martha asked, her voice soft but extremely serious, looking fixedly and directly into Kevin's tired eyes. "You're a 16-year-old boy, Kevin. You can barely manage to take minimal care of yourself and your sick grandmother. How do you realistically intend to properly care for a baby who needs constant and specialized medical attention, expensive specific medication, precise feeding every 2 hours, intensive care that requires technical knowledge you simply don't have?" Kevin stared at the tiny face of the baby, now quieter in Martha's experienced arms. She had temporarily stopped crying, but only because she was too exhausted, too weak to continue. Her little eyes were closed, her breathing shallow, irregular, labored. He thought intensely about how she was in that horrible trash bag, completely abandoned among stinking rubble and dirt, like worthless disposable waste, like something that mattered to absolutely no one. He thought painfully of how many people had possibly passed by that lot during the night, dozens certainly, maybe even hundreds, and had deliberately, consciously chosen not to see, not to hear, not to get involved in any way. chosen their own personal safety and individual convenience over the life of a completely innocent and helpless child. He thought of his own beloved mother, who had died at 34 after fighting desperately, heroically, to give Kevin the best life humanly possible in absolutely impossible circumstances. He thought of all the countless times he had been completely invisible, totally ignored, casually dismissed by the system that theoretically, supposedly, should protect vulnerable and marginalized children like him. "I'll find a way to take care of her," Kevin said with a firm voice, and there was an iron, unyielding determination in his voice that surprised even himself. "I don't know exactly how yet. I don't know if I'll actually be able to, but I'll try with everything I have, because literally no one else will try. Because if I do absolutely nothing, she'll die for sure. And I can't live knowing that I could have saved her and cowardly chose to do nothing." He paused, breathing deeply. "But I desperately need help, Aunt Martha. I need it so much. I need to urgently learn what to do, what she specifically needs, how to keep her alive. Can you teach me patiently, please, just until I figure out a better, more sustainable solution?" Martha looked for a long time at this boy, almost man, who had grown up too fast, who carried impossible responsibilities that no child should ever carry, who was proposing to take on even more in a desperate and probably doomed attempt to save a life. She saw the same absolutely fierce determination that she herself had when she fought tirelessly for years to get her children back from the system, when she worked 3 brutal jobs simultaneously to prove she was financially capable of supporting them, when she flatly refused to give up even when literally every lawyer and social worker repeatedly said it was completely impossible. "All right then," she said finally, her difficult decision made. "But Kevin, you have to promise me something extremely serious. If she gets significantly worse, if she goes into a serious medical crisis, if she starts to show clear signs that she's dying, you solemnly promise that you'll take her to the hospital immediately, even if it means terrible and devastating consequences for you personally. Her life comes first, always, no matter the personal cost to you. Do you promise that?" "I sincerely promise," Kevin said without any hesitation. It was a promise he genuinely didn't know if he could actually keep when the critical moment inevitably arrived. But it was a promise he absolutely had to make. If you've ever found yourself in an impossible situation where there was no right option, where every choice meant some kind of loss or pain, then you perfectly understand the moral dilemma Kevin was facing. Leave a comment if you would have the courage to do what he did. The next 72 hours were the most brutal, exhausting, and terrifying of Kevin's entire life, and considering he had tragically lost his mother at 12, had cared for a grandmother with progressive dementia alone for years, had worked since childhood, had experienced real hunger more times than he could mentally count, that really said a lot about the intensity of those 3 days. Martha miraculously managed to get special baby formula powder through a reliable acquaintance who worked at a donation bank coordinated by an evangelical church in the neighboring district. The formula was a special formulation suitable for premature babies or babies in special medical situations, enriched with crucial extra nutrients. A can cost an absurd $30, which would last maybe a full week with regular feedings every 2 hours without fail. Kevin didn't have $30 available. He barely had enough money for basic food for himself and his grandmother. Martha's acquaintance, a kind woman named Mrs. Teresa, who had tragically lost her own newborn grandson to severe malnutrition years ago, generously donated 3 precious cans without asking any inconvenient questions. "God provides in mysterious ways," she said simply with genuine faith, and Kevin felt such intense and overwhelming gratitude that it almost made him break down emotionally right there. Martha taught Kevin meticulously, repeatedly, with absolutely infinite patience. How to mix the formula in the exact correct proportion, 1 precise measure of powder for every ounce of water, no more, no less, because too concentrated would cause serious kidney problems and too diluted would not provide the necessary adequate nutrition. How to heat the water to the exact right temperature. Lukewarm like the sensitive inner skin of the wrist, not hot that would burn the baby's delicate mouth, not cold that would shock the fragile digestive system. How to hold the baby at the correct 45-degree angle to feed her safely, carefully supporting the head that she still couldn't control on her own at all. How to gently introduce the bottle's nipple, consciously letting the baby control the natural sucking rhythm to prevent dangerous choking. How to take strategic, regular breaks to burp, holding the baby firmly against his shoulder and patting her back firmly but extremely gently until he heard the characteristic burp that indicated that trapped air had been successfully expelled from the stomach. How to recognize worrying signs that the baby was eating too fast and might violently vomit everything up. How to change diapers, which Martha also managed to get through another network of female solidarity, women from the community donating what they could spare in an absolutely hygienic way, always cleaning meticulously from front to back to prevent urinary tract infections. How to identify painful diaper rash and treat it with appropriate ointment or simply leave the area exposed to air when possible. How to gently rock the baby to soothe her when she cried inconsolably, using consistent and rhythmic movements. How to identify different types of cries, hunger versus discomfort versus pain versus just the need for human contact. How to keep the baby warm but not too hot because newborns simply can't regulate their body temperature efficiently on their own. The baby had constant, violent, relentless colic. She literally cried for hours on end without stopping, her tiny body writhing in pain she didn't understand and couldn't communicate except through screams that tore Kevin's heart into painful pieces. Her stomach became hard, visibly distended. Her little legs instinctively curled up against her body. Her little face turned an intense dark red from the effort of crying. Kevin tried absolutely everything Martha patiently taught him. Extremely gentle massages on her tummy in precise clockwise circular motions. Careful bicycle exercises with her legs to help expel trapped gas. Holding the baby on her stomach over his forearm, her little head supported in Kevin's hand, and rocking gently. Nothing worked completely. The colic continued, relentless, cruel. The severe tremors from the withdrawal syndrome also persisted without improvement. Sometimes they were relatively mild, just her little hands trembling slightly. Other times, they were violent and terrifying, her whole body contracting in spasms that looked like epileptic seizures and made Kevin go into absolute panic, certain that this time the baby was really, finally dying and he would have to run desperately to the hospital admitting total defeat. But Martha patiently calmed him down, explained in detail that this was completely medically expected, that it would possibly last for entire weeks or even months, but that as long as the baby was breathing regularly, eating adequately, and urinating consistently, she was surviving day by day. Surviving was by no means ideal, but it was infinitely better than the terrible alternative. Kevin literally didn't sleep. For 72 full and consecutive hours, he stayed awake practically without any significant interruption, holding the baby constantly, feeding her religiously every 2 hours exactly even in the middle of the night, cleaning her meticulously, soothing her patiently, watching her compulsively to be absolutely sure that she was still breathing and alive. His eyes became so red and so swollen that they literally looked like they were bleeding at the edges. His vision was constantly blurry from extreme fatigue. His body ached intensely in places he didn't know could ache. His back from being in uncomfortable positions holding the baby for hours. His shoulders from constantly rocking. His arms from holding a weight that seemed to increase with each hour, but he simply didn't stop. He couldn't. During the day, when he theoretically should have been going to school and couldn't be absent without raising suspicion, Kevin stayed home, telling himself it was temporarily necessary. The baby needed him more urgently than his classes, but he knew rationally that he was missing important content, that his grades would plummet drastically, that he was seriously risking failing his critical senior year of high school. At night, when he absolutely had to go to school to avoid raising serious suspicion about prolonged and unexplained absences. Kevin left the baby with Martha. She skillfully hid her among her own 4 noisy grandchildren, one extra baby amidst the chaos of children that already occupied her tiny space. No one noticed, or if they occasionally did, they wisely chose not to ask inconvenient questions. But 3 nights a week, Martha worked the night shift cleaning in a commercial building from 6 to 10. On those specific nights, Kevin had absolutely no viable choice. He took the baby with him to school, hidden. He improvised a method that was absolutely insane, but worked for lack of a better alternative. He took his largest school backpack, carefully lined the inside with soft blankets to create a padded and safe space. He made small, discreet holes in the sides of the backpack to ensure adequate ventilation, holes that he carefully covered with dark pieces of fabric when he was in public so that no one would notice anything unusual. He gently placed the baby inside, wrapped like a burrito in light blankets. She usually slept most of the time, lulled by the constant movement and the muffled sound of the teacher's voice, which probably worked as comforting white noise. Kevin fed her an hour before leaving home and prayed fervently that she would sleep for the full 3 hours he would be in class. When she woke up and started to stir, small sounds of discomfort that only Kevin, hyper-attuned to her sounds, could hear above the classroom noise, he would ask to go to the bathroom. He would run to a locked stall, take the baby out of the backpack, check if she was okay, change her diaper if necessary, and quickly feed her with a bottle he kept in an improvised thermos. It was risky, absolutely insane. At any moment someone could notice, could hear a cry, could ask questions. But it worked for 2 surreal weeks where Kevin lived in a state of constant hypervigilance, his nervous system so stretched that he would startle at any unexpected sound. The baby was gradually getting better, very slowly, almost imperceptibly from day to day, but visibly improving. She started to gain weight, 4 ounces in 1 week, another 5 in the second week. Her cheeks started to fill out, no longer those deep dimples of severe malnutrition. The color of her skin improved, going from a worrying bluish tone to a healthier pink. The withdrawal tremors decreased in frequency and intensity. They still happened, but no longer several times an hour. The naval infection healed with Kevin's obsessive care, daily cleaning with hydrogen peroxide, regular changes of gauze, exposure to air when possible. The cord finally fell off on the 11th day, leaving a perfectly formed navel. And then, on the morning of the 14th day, something happened that made Kevin cry with pure relief. The baby looked directly at him, really looked, with focus and recognition, and smiled. It was just an involuntary muscle contraction, probably a reflex from gas, not an intentional social smile. But to Kevin, it seemed like a miracle. She was surviving. Against all odds, she was not just surviving, but beginning to thrive. Kevin gave her a name that day, Hope. It was the name of the squat where they lived, the only place Kevin called home. It was the name of the only thing he had to offer this baby. And it was exactly what she represented. Hope that love could overcome impossible circumstances. Hope that they would manage to survive together. Hope that tomorrow would be better than today. But Kevin knew this situation wasn't sustainable. He was destroying himself physically from exhaustion. He was missing critical classes. He had spent all the money he had saved. He needed real, professional help. And then the inevitable happened. The discovery he knew would eventually come. The teacher, Andrea Clark, heard the crying. Andrea Clark was 32 and had been teaching English and literature at a public high school for 5 years. She had deliberately chosen to teach at a night school, specifically because she wanted to work with students who the educational system had systematically and completely failed. Young workers who had no option to study during the day. Teenage mothers trying to complete their basic education while raising children. Illiterate adults seeking certification. People whom society often dismissed as a waste of time or lost causes. Andrea believed fervently, passionately, that education was the only real tool for social transformation, and she dedicated her life to proving it. One class at a time, one student at a time. Kevin had always been one of her best students, quiet, focused, with a sharp, natural intelligence. He read beyond the required curriculum. He asked deep questions. He wrote surprisingly mature essays on social injustice, inequality. Andrea had noticed worrying changes in recent weeks. Kevin, who never missed a day, had been absent. When he returned, he was even more exhausted. His hands trembled occasionally. He asked to go to the bathroom with unusual frequency. On a Thursday night during her class, on the literary analysis of The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck, ironically appropriate, a baby's cry echoed clearly, impossible to ignore, from the backpack at Kevin's feet. The entire classroom of 23 students fell absolutely silent. Conversations were cut off mid-sentence. Pens stopped scribbling. Everyone turned simultaneously to look at Kevin, who turned as pale as a ghost. The crying continued, getting louder, more insistent. There was absolutely no way to pretend it was anything else. It was clearly, unquestionably, indisputably the cry of a human baby coming from Kevin's backpack. "Kevin," Andrea said calmly, though her heart was racing violently. "Can you come with me to the hallway, please? Now." Kevin picked up his backpack with hands trembling so violently that he almost dropped it and followed the teacher out of the room. The crying grew louder, impossible to ignore. As soon as the door closed, Andrea turned to Kevin. "Kevin," she said, keeping her voice controlled with considerable effort, "open the backpack. Now." "Miss Clark, I can explain everything," Kevin began desperately. "Open the backpack," Andrea repeated, each word enunciated clearly. Kevin opened the backpack with trembling hands, and there was Hope, her little face red from crying so much, her tiny fists clenched and beating the air, her little eyes desperately searching for Kevin. Andrea felt her legs give way violently. She had to lean against the wall. "Kevin," she said when she could form words, "this is a baby. You have a human baby hidden in your school backpack." "I can explain everything," Kevin repeated, already picking up Hope and rocking her against his chest. The crying stopped immediately. "Please, Mom, let me explain everything completely before you call the police or social services. Please, just give me this chance." Andrea looked at this boy holding a baby who clearly recognized him, trusted him. All her training screamed to call the authorities. But something in the way Kevin held Hope, in the expression of obvious love and absolute terror, made Andrea hesitate. "My office," she said finally. "Now, you're going to sit down and tell me exactly in complete detail what is happening. And Kevin, don't lie to me, not once, because one lie and I'm calling the police immediately, understand?" "Yes, ma'am." "Thank you. Thank you so much." In the empty teacher's lounge, Kevin told her everything, finding Hope in the trash, the withdrawal, his decision to care for her, the impossible last 2 weeks. As he spoke, he continued to rock Hope, who had fallen back asleep against his chest. Andrea listened to everything in silence. When Kevin finished, she just processed for several minutes. "Kevin," she said finally, "you understand that what you're doing is technically illegal. In the eyes of the law, you've kidnapped this baby. It doesn't matter that your intentions were good. You've committed a serious crime." "I know," Kevin said, his voice trembling. "But, Mom, if I had taken her to the hospital, you know what would have happened. She would have gone to an overcrowded institution. Babies with withdrawal have a 50% chance of being adopted. The others spend their lives bouncing from foster home to foster home. Some just disappear." He paused. "I love her. In 2 weeks, she's become the most important thing in my life. When she cries, I feel the pain in my chest. She's given me a purpose beyond just surviving." Andrea felt tears. She thought of her daughter, whom she had lost to leukemia 7 years ago at the age of 2. She understood perfectly the love Kevin was describing. "She needs to see a doctor," Andrea said, "regularly. Vaccines, checkups. How do you plan to manage that?" "I don't know. I'm improvising, but I'll do anything." Andrea took out her cell phone. Kevin tensed up, but she didn't call the police. She called her brother. "Matthew, I need a favor." Can you examine a baby discreetly? No questions, no paperwork, no authorities. Silence. Then, what's going on? Trust me, it's important. All right, bring her tomorrow. Hospital, employee entrance, 9 o'clock. Andrea hung up. Kevin was crying. Why? Why are you helping me? Because sometimes the legally right thing isn't the morally right thing, and because I see in you a courage that few adults have. She paused. But Kevin, this can't go on like this. You can't raise a baby in hiding. She needs stability. We need to find a long-term solution. And it may be that this solution doesn't include you keeping her. Kevin hugged Hope tighter. I understand, but give me time. 2 weeks. I'll give you 2 weeks. But if we can't come up with something viable, I'll have to report it. Her life comes first, even if it breaks your heart. Dr. Matthew Clark examined Hope meticulously. Kevin watched his every move. She's surprisingly well, Matthew said after 40 minutes. All things considered, you've done an incredible job. The infection has cleared. The withdrawal has subsided. She's gained weight. Kevin felt relief. But she's still underweight. She needs special supplementation and urgent vaccinations, also tests to check for HIV, hepatitis. I can pay, I'll work more. Kevin, Matthew interrupted, what do you make? $100 on a good day. The tests cost thousands, you can't afford it. So what do I do? Matthew looked at Andrea. Leave it to me. I'll register her as a patient without documentation. I'll get vaccines, tests, formula through government programs and donations. But won't that get you in trouble? Probably. But if I chose pediatrics to follow rules instead of saving children, I chose the wrong profession. In the following 2 weeks, a support network formed. Martha continued to help. Andrea discreetly donated money. Dr. Matthew provided treatment at no cost. Mrs. Teresa from the church donated formula. Women in the squat donated diapers, clothes. Hope was flourishing. At 1 month, she was gaining weight properly. Her little eyes were focusing, following movement. She was making sounds beyond crying. When she saw Kevin, she lit up. Kevin was completely in love. Every smile made his heart explode. If you've ever loved someone like that, unconditionally, you know exactly that feeling. And if this story is moving you, share it so more people can see that love can spring from the most unlikely places. But reality was closing in. The 2 weeks were ending. Kevin had no sustainable solution. It was on a Tuesday during biology that everything changed. Kevin was at the back of the class, Hope sleeping in his lap. Andrea allowed it now. The teacher was talking about genetics when a new student came in late. Sorry, I missed the bus. You are Julia Morse. Kevin glanced over distractedly and froze completely. The girl was 15, maybe 16, very thin, deep dark circles under her eyes, worn-out uniform, slouched posture. But her eyes. Kevin looked into Julia's eyes and then at Hope. They were exactly the same. Kevin watched Julia sit down. Hope woke up and stirred. Kevin adjusted her, and at that moment Julia turned around. Their eyes met. They fell to Hope. Kevin saw the exact moment Julia recognized the baby. The color drained from her face. Her eyes widened in terror. Julia stood up so abruptly that her chair fell over, and she ran. Kevin didn't think. He got up and ran after her, Hope in his arms. He found Julia in the hallway, leaning against the wall, sliding down to the floor, hyperventilating, tears soaking her t-shirt. You found her, Julia cried. Oh my God, you found my baby. She's alive. You're her mother, Kevin said. Julia nodded, unable to stop crying. I didn't know what to do. I swear I didn't know. It's okay, Kevin said softly. Breathe. She's okay. I took care of her. It's okay. No, it's not, Julia screamed. I threw my daughter in the trash. What kind of monster does that? Stop. Breathe. Tell me what happened. Julia slid down to sit. Kevin knelt beside her. My name is Julia Morse. I'm 15, and my stepfather raped me for 2 years. Kevin felt nausea rise. My mother didn't believe me when I told her. She called me a liar, said I was a slut trying to seduce her husband. She wiped her face. When I found out I was pregnant, I hid it. I wore baggy clothes. I stopped eating. No one noticed. Kevin listened in horror. When I went into labor, it was 2 in the morning. I locked the bathroom door. I bit a towel so I wouldn't scream. It lasted for 6 hours. I was alone, bleeding, and when she was born, Julia looked at Hope with love and agony. I held her for 10 minutes, and in those 10 minutes I loved her more than anything. But I knew that if my stepfather found out, he would kill her. He said so. Renewed tears. I'm a user too. He gave me crack when I was 14, said it would make me relax. So I wrapped her up, and I prayed that someone good would find her. Someone who could take better care of her than a 15-year-old addict who was being raped. She looked at Kevin. And you found her. You saved her life. What's your name? Julia. Julia, what's her name? I didn't give her one. I couldn't. I named her Hope. Julia let out a sound between a laugh and a cry. Perfect. Hope whimpered. Kevin, following his instinct, extended her to Julia. Do you want to hold her? Julia looked terrified, but took her with trembling hands. Hope calmed down. She looked at Julia, a primitive recognition, mother and daughter. Julia held her and cried for everything lost. Kevin let her cry. Then he asked, Julia, do you still live with him? She nodded. Does he still do that? Another nod. Have you used crack recently? 3 days ago. Julia, we have to tell someone. He needs to be arrested. You need help. And a decision needs to be made about Hope. Do you want her back? Because if you do, we'll fight together. But you'll have to get clean, report him, get treatment. I do, Julia said immediately. I want my daughter, but I don't know how. We'll figure it out together, but first, we're getting you out of that house today. Andrea sat and listened to everything. Her face was pale, her hands were clenched. This man needs to be arrested today. But if I report him, they'll take Hope away from me, Julia said. Not if I have anything to say about it, Andrea said. She picked up the phone. First call, Dr. Matthew, to document the abuse. Second, a lawyer specializing in minors. Third, Rebirth House, an organization that helped adolescent victims of violence. Fourth, a specialized police department to report the rape. Within 48 hours, an operation was in motion. The police were investigating the stepfather. Julia was in a specialized shelter. The lawyer was building a case. But there was a problem. Hope, the social worker, Dr. Helen Rhodes, was clear. You understand that this situation is extraordinarily irregular. Kevin, you committed kidnapping of a minor. Julia, you abandoned a newborn. Both of you could face consequences. But they won't, said the lawyer, Ms. Evans. We will argue extreme circumstances. Kevin saved this child. Julia is a victim of abuse. And the baby? Dr. Rhodes asked. What's best for her? Heavy silence. The protocol would be to place her in a temporary foster home. And the chances of a teenage addict getting custody are close to 0, Julia sobbed. Kevin took her hand. What about an alternative solution? Dr. Matthew suggested. Kevin and Julia raise her together with supervision. Kevin is a minor living in an illegal squat. It's not viable. So, Kevin said, after everything, saving her, caring for her, loving her, you're just going to take her away anyway? Put her in the system that fails? I understand that it seems unfair, but my job is to protect the child, and a temporary home with strangers is better. You know the statistics. Yes, I know, and it breaks my heart, but I can't change the system alone. It was Andrea who spoke. What if Kevin wasn't in a squat? What if he had a proper home? Everyone turned around. I have a 2-bedroom apartment. I've lived alone since I lost my daughter 7 years ago. Kevin, I'd like to offer you that room. No rent. I just need you to continue studying. Kevin stared at her in shock. Ma'am, you don't have to. I know I want to. You reminded me why I chose to be a teacher. It would be an honor to help you. And me? Julia asked. Do I lose her anyway? No, Ms. Evans said. Not if you fight. It will be hard. Getting clean. Therapy. But we can argue for supervised shared custody. I'll do it, Julia said. I'll do anything. Dr. Rhodes studied each face. She saw determination in Kevin, hope in Julia. All right, I'll approve a 6-month trial period. Kevin will live with Andrea and care for Hope under my supervision. Julia will complete treatment and participate in supervised visits. If at the end everyone is meeting the conditions and Hope is thriving, we'll re-evaluate. And if it doesn't work, Kevin asked, then Hope will go up for adoption, and you will have done everything possible. Andrea's apartment was transformed. The empty room got colorful wallpaper, a crib, toys. Hope was thriving. At 4 months, she was at an ideal weight. She smiled genuinely, laughed, rolled over. She was a healthy, happy, loved baby. Kevin was transforming too. With a stable home, he focused on his studies. His grades improved. He still collected recyclables on the weekends, but he had time to be a teenager. Julia was fighting fiercely. She completed detox. She had been clean for 4 months. She was in therapy 3 times a week. She participated in a daily group. She was studying to complete high school. Her stepfather was in prison. Her mother had abandoned her, chose her husband, but Julia discovered that it was a blessing. She visited Hope 3 times a week. She learned to change diapers, prepare bottles, rock her to sleep, recognize different cries, and slowly, a bond formed. Hope recognized Julia. She smiled when she arrived. She stretched out her little arms. Julia cried when Hope made a sound that sounded like "Mama." They were just experimental sounds, but to Julia, it was everything. After 3 months, Dr. Rhodes authorized unsupervised visits. First half an hour, then an hour, then a whole afternoon. At the 6-month hearing, Dr. Rhodes presented her report. This is one of the most unusual situations I've encountered, but also one of the most successful. Hope is thriving. Kevin has demonstrated extraordinary maturity. Julia is in consistent recovery. Andrea has created a stable environment. She paused. Therefore, I recommend that this situation become permanent, with conditions. Kevin continues to live with Andrea. Julia continues treatment. Both participate in parenting classes, and I will make quarterly visits for 2 years. Kevin and Julia hugged each other, crying. Hope gurgled happily. Afterward, on the sidewalk, Julia turned to Kevin. Thank you for saving our daughter, for giving me a second chance. We saved her together, and we're going to raise her together. Our way, Julia agreed, smiling. Andrea watched these 2 young people with the baby they had saved. She thought of her lost daughter and felt that she had been given a second chance. Not in the way she had planned, but in the way she needed. 3 years later, Kevin was 19, a sophomore in social work at NYU on a full scholarship. He chose it because he wanted to work with vulnerable youth. Julia was 18 and had been clean for 3 years, 2 months, and 14 days. She had completed high school, gotten a job. She saw Hope daily, participated in all decisions, was a complete mother. Hope was 3.5, bright, talkative, full of energy. She called Kevin Keiko, Julia Mama, Andrea Dea. She didn't know she had been found in the trash. She didn't know about withdrawal, abuse, a broken system. Eventually they would tell her, but for now, she only knew that she was loved. One Sunday afternoon, they were in Central Park. Kevin was pushing Hope on the swing. Hiya, Keiko! Julia and Andrea were preparing a picnic. You know what's funny? Kevin said. When I found her, I thought I was saving her, but she was the one who saved me, gave me a purpose, made me realize I was capable of more. She saved all of us, Julia agreed, gave me a reason to stay clean, to fight, and gave me a second chance to be a mother, Andrea added, to turn pain into love. Hope ran up to them, holding out a dandelion. Make a wish, Keiko. Kevin took the flower but didn't blow. My wish has already come true. And there, in that ordinary park, an extraordinary family celebrated a life built through love, determination, and a refusal to give up. A life that began in the most unlikely of places, in the trash. A life that proved that love can spring from the darkest of places. That family can be chosen, that a broken system can be challenged, that invisible children can be seen, loved, and saved. If this story touched you deeply, if it made you think about how we fail our most vulnerable children, give it a thumbs up. Share this message to remind everyone that every child deserves to be seen, loved, and saved. And if you know someone working to protect at-risk children, send them this story. Because heroes come in all forms, and sometimes they're only 16 but have a heart bigger.